Good evening. My name is Cheryl Banks. I'm the Communications Manager for the Cleveland Heights University Heights Public Library System, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's public forum, East Side Redevelopment, Prospects for Reinvention, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, Case Western Reserve University's Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, and the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I have a brief announcement. The League of Women Voters has 3 more events coming up this week and next. The first is called Impact, a practical guide to political action. That's at 7 p.m. tomorrow at Shaker Heights High School. The second is Ohio Redistricting Training. That's Saturday, May 13th at 9:30 a.m. at the First Unitarian Church in Shaker Heights. And the third is Fracking and the Impact of the Utica Shale on Ohio. And that's Tuesday, May 16th, 7 p.m. in Solon. If you need more information, you can find it on the League of Women Voters of Cleveland website, and that's lwvgreatercleveland.org. So tonight's moderator, Terry Schwarz, is the director of Kent State University's Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. Her work at the collaborative includes neighborhood and campus planning, commercial and residential design, commercial and residential design guidelines, stormwater management, and green infrastructure strategies. Terry launched the CUDC's Shrinking Cities Institute in 2005 in an effort to understand and address the implications of population decline and large-scale urban vacancy in Northeast Ohio. As an outgrowth of the Shrinking Cities Institute, she established Pop-Up City, a temporary use initiative for vacant and underutilized sites in Cleveland. And in 2009, Terry received the Cleveland Arts Prize for Design. She teaches in the graduate design curriculum for the Kent State University College of Architecture and Environmental Design. She has a bachelor's in English from the Illinois Institute of Technology and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Cornell University. So ladies and gentlemen, Terry Schwarz.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I really wasn't expecting a crowd this size. It's like Tuesday night at the Heights Library. It's where it's all going on. So thank you. Thanks for coming, and I hope we'll have a nice, lively conversation this evening. Previously, the League of Women Voters hosted a forum that Steve Litt moderated on development on the west side of the city and in the western suburbs. And so this is sort of the bookend to that. Tonight, we're going to be talking about projects, innovative development that is happening in the east side. And so the way that it will work is that we have 4 panelists tonight. I'll introduce them each in sequence, and they'll have an opportunity to talk about their work. Throughout, we're eager to hear your questions. Because of the size of the crowd, we'd love it if you wouldn't mind jotting your questions down on a card, and Mike will have the cards and also pick them up, and so I will ask questions as we go. But so each speaker will have about 10 minutes to talk about their work, and then we'll have a little group chat, and then we'll open it up for questions with all of you. I think the most important things to think about tonight is that, it really isn't meant to be sort of an east side versus west side debate, because I think that we've all kind of heard that before, kind of things happen on the east side, things happen on the west, and it's really about differentiating and highlighting some of the catalytic projects underway on this side of the city and on this side of the county. And also just looking briefly at the development context, some of the opportunities and barriers to development on the east side. So I'm going to start there with just a couple of brief remarks, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists. And so I think one of the things that we should all kind of keep in mind tonight is that one of the challenges that east side neighborhoods particularly face is depicted in this map. About 2 years ago now, the Thriving Communities program at the Western Reserve Land Conservancy surveyed the entire city of Cleveland. they gave every property a grade of A through F. And just like in school, A is good. The D and F properties are the properties in poor condition or dangerous condition and need to be demolished. And so what this map is showing in red are the areas where there are larger numbers of D and F properties and greater concentrations of D and F properties. The areas in blue represent places where the majority, the major clusters of properties are A's and B's. So again, it's not a value judgment, but just an important thing to understand that, kind of the level of disinvestment on the east side, particularly in what, kind of some folks call the, let's see if I have they call the Cleveland Crescent, which is this sort of red area here, is an area of major distress. And so when you're doing development projects in a context where the real estate market is fragile, it does pose different sorts of challenges. Now, I just want to show you briefly part of the reason why there's so many D and F buildings in the east side neighborhoods relates to the subprime mortgage foreclosure crisis. And I think we all know that foreclosures happened across the county, but this map really shows much a similar pattern, that there were more foreclosures and more concentrations of foreclosed properties on the east side of the city and in the eastern suburbs, particularly, East Cleveland, Maple Heights, Garfield. So lastly, kind of going back a little further in time, this is a redlining map from 1939. And I think it's important to recognize that the map looks a lot like the other two, and that's not a coincidence. So recognizing that, kind of policies, federal policies, because in the redlined areas, Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration loans and loan guarantees weren't available, particularly in these neighborhoods which had concentrations of African-American families. It wasn't subtle. If you read the historical documentation, the reason that loans in these red areas were considered a risk were really tied to the race of the people who lived there. So of course, if you have parts of a city or a region that were starved for capital, it made those areas more vulnerable to predatory lending practices, and it brings us to this place where we are today, which is a place where we have a lot of work to do on both sides of the city and throughout the county, but I think we need to recognize that the hill is a little steeper on the east side of the city. If you're interested in the inventory, there's a book, up there. It's fascinating reading. Maybe I'm the only one who thinks so. But it's available online if you'd like to see more of the maps, because really a lot of the adverse social indicators and physical indicators really reflect the same pattern, that the east side cities are harder hit. But the point of tonight isn't really to talk about, kind of just the challenges that are affecting the east side of the city, but also talking about some of the really innovative work that's happening in these neighborhoods despite the challenges that we face. And so we're going to start tonight with Mansfield Frazier, who has been working in the Huff neighborhood. Mansfield is a developer, a writer, a social entrepreneur, an activist, a vintner. Oprah Winfrey thinks he's awesome. And so I introduced Mansfield by saying this, that many years ago, I think it was 2008 or 2009, I got an email from Mansfield. We didn't know each other, but I got an email from Mansfield on Thanksgiving, I think, where Mansfield was talking about wanting to start a vineyard in the Huff neighborhood. So I, of course, launched into a long email while I was basting the turkey about soil science and, kind of the ground conditions that you need and the microclimates that are essential for productive growing of grapes. And Mansfield very rapidly pointed out that I was really not understanding where he was coming from, which is the idea. It's not about the kind of ecological circumstances, but really the social circumstances that made Chateau Huff and the vineyard in Huff so important. It's about changing the narrative of a neighborhood, and I think that this project really represents that in a pretty spectacular way. Before the vineyard and the winemaking enterprise, Mansfield, built a lot of homes in Hough. But really, given the challenges of the foreclosure crisis and difficulties in terms of getting capital for development, shifting to kind of this greening project, really intending to build a real estate market to develop more kind of interest in the neighborhood, so that economic development would follow. Important to also note that that in addition to Mansfield's efforts, the Huff neighborhood has the kind of League Park facility that's very near to Chateau Huff. So you start to get a couple of assets, a couple of neighborhood amenities that really begin to change the way that people perceive the neighborhood. And I think that really that is one of Mansfield's really big contributions to the city of Cleveland, is really changing the way that we think about this very historic neighborhood. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mansfield so he can talk about his work. Mansfield, you can talk from there if you like, or from up here.
Oh, this is fine.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Terry. She mentioned that I have a project called Chateau Huff. And I tell people, that's our vineyard. It's a political name. If I would have said Chateau Hunting Valley, nobody would have raised an eyebrow. If I would have said Chateau Westlake, well, but of course. You say Chateau Huff, people do a double take. What we're basically saying, what I was saying, is that the land we occupy in Huff is just as valuable to us as the land other people in other communities is to them. Now, with that said, there was one mistake you made, Terry. You said that they used to redline. Redline started, yes, in the 30s, government-sponsored redlining. And this country was built on two things, slavery and credit. We got rid of one, I guess. We still don't have equal credit. That's what keeps marginal communities, that's what keeps black communities, that's what keeps black businessmen out of ascending, is the absence, the lack of the ability to get credit. Now, we broke through that for a while in Huff. There was, starting in 1989, a police commander, Billy Tell, built a upscale home on Chester and 89th Street. And everyone, including my friend Norm Krumholtz, said, that's not going to work. Nobody wants to live there. What are you wasting that kind of money for? What they didn't realize is that there was a pent-up demand for blacks who wanted to live in their own community and not have to chase after somebody else to live in a middle-class community. Because what had happened up to then, up until the 80s, all through the 60s, when the civil rights movement started integration, and don't get me wrong, I'm an integrationist, but I say integration has to work both ways. And integration won't work in America until both races want integration. Integration can't be done with one race. So Billy Tell built this home, and other blacks, swarms of other blacks, built new homes in Huff. My wife and I did. We were kind of latecomers. We've been there 17 years. What has happened is that since then, you can't, when the housing crisis came in 2008, and I built the last new home in Huff, my partner and I, since then, you can't get a loan to build in Huff. Now, it's nothing to do with the market, and I can prove it. If one of the new homes in Huff goes up for sale, it never lasts a month. When I say new, I mean built within the last 25 years. It never lasts a month. And they get full value for it. They get high price, it's gone quickly. So that shows that the market is strong. But still, people cannot get loans to live in Huff, even though there's many upscale communities, upscale neighborhoods in and around Huff. That's what causes, and they give all kinds of reasons. It's not a risk to the banks. Nobody's foreclosing. I mean, nobody is failing on their mortgages. People pay their rent, pay their mortgage. So you have to look at other reasons why, and a lot of it is perceptions. I built a vineyard to change perceptions. I wanted people, when they think of Huff, that they don't think of the uprising that some people call a riot. One man's riot is another man's uprising. I wanted to change the thought processes to people start thinking about vineyards. We're very close to Lake Park. So there's a lot of things that we have, the residents of Ward 7, which is totally different than a lot of the rest of the other East Side, and that's because we're very close to the cultural center of Cleveland. Ward 7, Hough, is equal distance between University Circle, where there's wealth and stability, and downtown, right along Chester Avenue. So it was obvious why that would be very valuable land. It would be very, fortuitous for someone to want to live there. What's got us scratching our heads now is, why have we stalled? And I really think that we've stalled because when bankers got the opportunity to stop giving loans in Hough due to the housing crash, other parts of the country, other communities have come back strongly. The east side of Cleveland has not come back. Now, you can say, look at Kinsman neighborhood. There's not much value there. You can say, look at Glenville. But I can show you on a map, because I asked the foundation library, a woman at the foundation, to do me a map of where philanthropic giving goes in Cleveland. The largest area of philanthropic giving, of course, is University Circle. Biggest dot. Got all the major institutions. Then if you start looking where philanthropic giving goes around the rest of the city, it's Detroit Shoreway, it's Tremont, it's North Collingwood, it's every place but communities of color. And it takes philanthropy to start jump-starting this and developers will follow philanthropy. We've been able to break through it some with our project, with our vineyard, and now our winery, but it has been a real challenge and an uphill battle all the way, and we still are not there because perceptions change very slowly. There is a perception that the East Side is dangerous. There's a perception of poverty. Now, if you go to certain parts of Ward 7, that perception is a reality. Let's be honest. Poverty causes crime. No two ways about it. If you don't solve the problems of poverty, you're going to have crime. But this wholesale disinvestment, and it's all tied. It's the housing and development, and I will say there are some wonderful things happening on the East Side, particularly in Ward 7 around Hough. There's a new dental clinic. There's a University Hospitals is building a women's and children's facility. All of those are major institutions that make investments. But when we talk about the person on the street, when you talk about people being able to move into homes, and I'm talking about people with money, I'm talking about lawyers, doctors, can't get a loan in Hough, and there's something wrong with that. And our powers that be, our courts, let these banks continue to redline.
Thanks, Mansfield. I should point out that Mansfield has another engagement a little later tonight, so if any of you have questions for Mansfield, now would be a good time to write it on a card and write Mansfield Frazier on the top, so I'd be sure to ask it before he needs to leave us. We're going to move a little bit further east now to the St. Clair Superior neighborhood. Rick Semersky runs a company called VIP. Mike's coming around with them. He's right behind you, so he should be here shortly. So I'd like to now introduce Rick Semersky of VIP Construction. VIP, if you are ever downtown, you will see their logo on all of the big construction projects happening. They are involved in a lot of really interesting restoration projects. I met Rick actually when he very generously agreed to help with a small restoration project. My students were rehabbing a vacant house in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood, and we were all standing outside the house waiting for someone to show up with a key. And Rick came, and with one very well-placed kick to the back door, we were in the house. And I knew at that moment that I was dealing with a man of action. So in addition to running this big company, he also is responsible for a lot of development focused around the intersection of 55th Street and St. Clair. What you're seeing here in the picture is the Hub 55 project, which has a lot of components to it, but it fundamentally is about bringing food, healthy local food, to a city neighborhood. It also includes Cafe 55, which is a great place to get lunch, and also the new Goldhorn Brewery. Rick also owns Sturley's Country House, which is, kind of old Cleveland in the most classic sense, but also really reinvented. It's one of the few places you go in Cleveland where it can be both sort of old school and hipster at the same time. And also at the same intersection, he is about to embark on a major restoration project to this wonderful old Carnegie Library building. So I will turn it over to Rick.
All right. So anyway, Terry, appreciate you having us in, and I want to thank Joyce and Wayne and my good friend Mansfield Frazier for letting me share this stage. As Terry and everyone will point out, I'm a 45-year-old kid from Cleveland who owns a construction company who's thankfully saved a lot of the most historic buildings in the city of Cleveland. And I wouldn't be up here today except for the fact that in 2012, I bought a schnitzel and beer joint called Sturley's Country House in East 55th Street in a neighborhood that has a lot of meaning to me because my grandparents grew up there. But a lot of people had forgotten about it. And since then, we've embarked on what most people consider a pretty crazy neighborhood really reconcentration. As Mansfield has said, the East Side's got lots of. It's an uphill battle. Again, I'm a kid from 1972 who was born in South Euclid, who understands what the East Side and the West Side means. And as we all know, it's the river, and it's the one side's the one side and the other side's the other side. And as I always like to joke, people who don't think good things happen on the East Side, you have to remember every time you go to downtown, we actually have the East Side. So every time you go to an Indians game, a Cavs game, or eat on East 4th Street, you're on the East Side of Cleveland. So I just want to point that out for the record, Mr. Litt, as I see you pointing out over there. But anyway, let's get to the positive stuff. First of all, the people up here are doing great things. It's interesting that I'm here on a panel again with my good friend Mansfield down in Hough that we've worked with together for years. As League Park was up there, my construction company did all the outside work at League Park. As we sit here with the people from Shaker Heights, Goldhorn Brewery, which we just opened, is one of the major tenants that's coming to Van Aken downtown, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. And we've done lots of work with Neighborhood Progress over the years. So it's really interesting that while people want to think the East Side hasn't been paid attention to, there are people on the East Side, including our friends at City Architecture here in the audience, who have done all of our work and who have great belief in what we're doing, really understand that there are really great things happening on the East Side. And you can blame it on whatever you want, that people haven't paid attention to it, but I'm glad that people are finally paying attention to it. I'm proud to be investing all of my money and time and effort in the East Side of Cleveland, and I'm glad that VIP Restoration, who is a 30-year-old construction company who has 200 union employees, that has been on the East Side of Cleveland since our existence, still is there, and we've decided to spend our money from a redevelopment standpoint because my grandmother grew up right down the street from Sturley's Country House, is still there. And so what's great about what we're doing is that it is really, truly grassroots. It's Rust Belt. It's word of mouth. When I left the Hub 55 today, there are people there that have never been to the East Side before. They're finally coming there because there are great things to do there. And what I always tell them every time they ask me is that I'm not redefining a neighborhood. We're not redeveloping a neighborhood. I'm just making people start to pay attention to some great neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland. And I hope that that continues through my construction company, through Hub 55, and through everything else that we're doing. Most people think I'm crazy that I own a 62-year-old Slovenian restaurant. I own a healthy foods cafe, and I own a brewery. And but the good thing is that I can honestly tell you that there are people coming to a neighborhood that they wouldn't come to before. And those are the type of things, along with Terry's class and the kids from Kent State that we got to spend all summer with last year, that got to build a house and live in the neighborhood and thankfully have a couple of beers at Goldhorn Brewery. There are great things happening, and I could go on for 2 hours, but what I would really love to do is turn it over to the rest of my panel and then answer a bunch of great questions from you guys. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Terry.
Thank you, Rick. So we're going to continue our eastward trek to Wayne Mortensen at Neighborhood Progress. Wayne is the Director of Design and Development at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, many of you probably know, is a nonprofit organization that serves as an umbrella for community development corporations throughout the city of Cleveland. And what I have, I just collected a couple of quick introductory slides, but the point I'm trying to illustrate here is a lot similar to what Rick had said about, kind of the work he's doing in St. Clair Superior. It's not one investment, but multiple investments clustered together for a larger impact. And I think that Cleveland Neighborhood Progress has sometimes actually taken some criticism for this, but for focusing resources on some really kind of key opportunities. Those are choices we have to make, is spreading the resources we have across the city or picking some, kind of opportunities to really make something larger happen. So if you don't know this project at St. Luke's Point that's depicted here, it's the restoration of the old St. Luke's Hospital. It has senior housing in it and an intergenerational school. It has a Boys and Girls Club and a variety of agencies based in the building. On the same campus, there's a new school and a brand new library. And Wayne is now working to encourage additional development of housing just north of the St. Luke's Hospital, and simultaneously working with the RTA to renovate and actually rebuild the train station at East 116th Street. So it's, it's kind of the same idea. It's go big or go home, I guess. And it's a lot of projects kind of happening clustered together to try to really change the narrative of the neighborhood. So I'm going to really quickly switch to Wayne's images here that I have waiting for you. There we go. Oops. Should be good to go.
Great.
Thanks, Wayne.
I think Terry gave my presentation for me, so I'll just say thank you and sit back down. What a kind of a weird night to be doing this. If you could just give me a hand signal if President Trump resigns in the next 10 minutes, that'd be really be helpful to know while we're presenting here. Just a quick note on background about me, because I think it's important to understand kind of where I come from. My graduate education and my background is not just in architecture, but also urban design and social work. I overlapped those 3 degrees thinking that somewhere in the middle I could find a relevant career in trying to do the things we're talking about tonight. I have found so far at least momentary relevance at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, which is the organization where I work, and I'm proud to be there. At CNP, we have 3 focus areas. The traditional real estate development and placemaking portfolio is in the placemaking section of our work, but we have 2 others called economic opportunity, which deals with the social infrastructure of communities, and then CDC advancement, which tries to build capacity in the CDC infrastructure of Cleveland and coordinate a citywide recovery agenda. We have 2 subsidiaries at Neighborhood Progress. I just think this is helpful from a structural standpoint. We have a developer called New Village Corporation and a lender called Village Capital. So we have in-house development and in-house lending, which is really critical in neighborhoods in Cleveland where you can't always get the conventional lending together, as Rick would probably attest. You can't always get conventional lending together in some of these shakier markets. Our funding, Neighborhood Progress, comes 50% from the Cleveland philanthropic community. The Cleveland Foundation, the George Gund Foundation, and the Mort Mandel Foundation are the 3 biggest funders of the organization. And then the rest of that comes from grants, government support, and income that we generate through development projects. These are our closest and dearest partners throughout the city. These are the CDCs that really do the work of the communities on the ground that we try to coordinate and help whenever possible. And this is the problem that we face. This is a different version of the map that Terry showed you, but Terry did this map too. So I'm going to blame her for both. But you see here, it's both the crux of our problem and the nature of our opportunity. On this map, the green is our green space, our parks, our preserve, our nature space. The red is our vacancy. We currently have over 10,000 vacant homes and nearly 3,000 acres of vacant land. And so if you combine those all into one consideration, you have the idea that you can completely remake the city a couple times over with that ability. How we're working on this is several different ways. I'm going to go through research first. I know this is impossible to read, so I'm just going to summarize. Residential parcels with a structure. Basically everywhere but one neighborhood in the entire city has less structures has less land with residential structures than they did 4 years ago. And you can see the ones that are highlighted in yellow, those are the east side neighborhoods. So you see the concentration, although it's not, binary, you can see the concentrated neighborhoods at the bottom have experienced the most loss, the most erasure, the most development over the last 4 years and beyond. But there are positive trends. Postal vacancy. This is an indicator that basically when the post office says nobody's living there, we get that data. And you can see here, actually you can't see here, but at the end, the last column shows little line graphs about how things have gone over the last 5 years. All but 2 of those neighborhoods have experienced declines in postal vacancy, which means there's an increase in occupancy. Another good thing to talk about is foreclosure filings. We haven't heard the word good with foreclosure in a long time, but in this chart we can see all but 2 east side neighborhoods have significantly fewer foreclosure filings now than 5 years ago. Arm's length sales, which means somebody's selling their home, their house or their home or their property to somebody else. Person to person, not person to bank, not person to corporation, but person to person. All of these, you'll have to just trust me because nobody can see this. All of those line charts, except for 2, are either stable or improving. So additional property turnover in these neighborhoods. This map done by Justin Fleming in our office shows real estate value of those arm's length translation or of those arm's length transfers. That big spike on the left side of the center, that's Edgewater. Those other tiny spikes on the right side, that's University Circle. We still have a lot of work to do here. The issue, even though we're seeing more and more transfer, is now property value, is getting comps, is getting the values necessary for people to sell their homes for the price near what they paid for it, if not better. We have still about 10,000 vacant units in the city. About half of those are in what we would call redevelopment friendly condition that you wouldn't need to do significant work on. What we're missing right now are those medium scaled redevelopers and rehabbers to come in and do redevelopment at scale. But the appraisal is a catch-22. Although you can get the land and the building's cheap, you can't currently sell it for what you put into it because of those arm's length transfers, those appraisals that are happening. And so Cleveland Neighborhood Progress and Jeff Kipp, our marketing director, is working with the real estate groups and with the appraisers to figure out how to get this problem taken care of. And that means I've got a couple minutes. We did a rehab impact study. I just want to direct people to, it's at www.rehabimpact.com. And that study looked at 1,081 programmatic rehabs done over the last 5 years. We were able to get rid of all the variables. There's this ridiculous formula down here that got rid of all the variables in our analysis. And we figured out that those 1,081 rehabs preserved $540 million of property value, not only in Cleveland, but in the inner ring suburbs. And so basically what that means, if you subtract that or find the average of those 1,081, there's about $500,000 of economic value for every single structure that's rehabbed in the city of Cleveland. And so that's really what we're worried about now. We're looking, this map, the yellow, shows properties that are of rehab potential in blocks that have at least a $20,000 property sale average and 80% occupancy. So these are the ways we're trying to thread the needle. There are development opportunities throughout Cleveland, and we want to help people get there. The other ways we work are through programs, the Reimagining Cleveland program. This is what Chateau Huff looks like, by the way. Mansfield doesn't bring imagery with him because it's not, he thinks he's impressive enough to just carry the day. But this is one of the crown jewels of the Reimagining Cleveland program. And then this is the other end of that spectrum, which is the largest urban farm in the United States, just behind CMHA on West 25th Street. We do planning work. This is a 5-mile corridor study for West 25th, all the way down to a 1-block study of East 130th Street behind Shaker Square, in which we developed a series of development scenarios for that group. And then, as Terry pointed out, no need to talk about Legacy or St. Luke's Hospital because Terry kind of did that already. But I bet half of you here were probably born in that facility. If you're a native Clevelander, it seems about 40% of all East Side residents were born in this facility. This is what it looked like when we bought it for $1. And this is what it looks like today. 2/3 of the facility is affordable housing for seniors. The other third was my personal headache for 4 years. It's the headquarters for the highest performing K-8 public charter in the state, which means they don't charge tuition, they don't have admission requirements. We brought them together with the Boys and Girls Club, the preschool, our office, and the headquarters of St. Luke's Foundation. They brought them back to Buckeye, their birthplace. And this is what it looks like today. This was the third floor of the school. Here's one of those classrooms today. Here's what it looks like with the teacher stuff in it. This was the lobby today. And then this was the teaching auditorium. 650 nurses and doctors would sit in here twice a week and listen to lectures. And today it's multi-purpose gymnacafetorium for the students. But it really doesn't mean anything until the kids are there and inhabiting the place again. The reason we did St. Luke's 6-year, 3-phase, $63 million project was because we were able to leverage $120 million of investment within a half mile of that campus, including the Harvey Rice Elementary School and the Rice Branch Library, which went from the second least used in the system to the second most used library in the Cleveland Public Library system. Here's a picture of that RTA station that City Architecture is helping us with. And here's some of that new housing behind the hospital. This is just one example of one community on the east side, and I think it demonstrates our intent. I show this last diagram as just a way of giving some insight into our decision-making process. This is our score sheet about how we assess projects that we're going to take on. And I just want to point out that project location We give ourselves 2 more points for East Side neighborhoods than West Side because of the historic disinvestment and low-income benefit. The more impoverished the neighborhood is, the more we feel inclined to be involved. On the other side is the business factors, who we're partnering with, does the community have capacity? All of this lends to us very seriously considering every East Side project that's presented to us. The moral of the story is that there's a lot of great ideas from Rick and Mansfield and others. It's really our purpose and our desire and the reason we exist to shepherd those into being and create better communities on the East Side throughout Cleveland.
Thanks, Wayne. Before we go to our last panelist, I'll just mention that one of the questions I got was, are the slides going to be available? Yes, I can certainly make the kind of introductory slides available. Wayne, is it okay if we share yours as well? So particularly for any of you here, but also for any of you watching this remotely on your computer screen, we can make those slides available so you'll see what you missed. Our last speaker, actually in the last day or so, I've gotten a bunch of emails from people wondering why we don't have more suburban participants on this panel. And it's really primarily because we only have an hour and a half, and Mike didn't want me to invite 8 people. I do think that there's a lot of innovative work going on throughout the suburbs, the East Side suburbs, but I think that what's happening in Shaker Heights is particularly remarkable, and I say that with a little bit of bias. Joyce Braverman, who's the director of the planning department in Shaker Heights, is actually the first person in Cleveland I ever met in 1990 when she hired me to work for the Shaker Heights planning department. And so it was the late 90s when the city embarked on a strategic plan that focused primarily on 2 major intersections. That's Lee and Chagrin, or Shakertown Center, and then the Warrensville-Van Aken intersection at the eastern end of the city. So the city for years worked on implementing the ideas for the Shakertown Center intersection and made a lot of infrastructure investments, real estate investments, green space investments, and now they've moved on to downtown Van Aken, which is the Warrensville-Van Aken-Chagrin intersection. Before I turn it over to Joyce, I'll just show you this. I'm sure any of you who live on the East Side are familiar with this intersection. And the idea here is about making something that is very car-oriented, a pedestrian-friendly intersection. And I know you're thinking, can't be done, right? But actually, there are plans underway to really transform that part of the city. And if you've been to this intersection in Shaker, you can see the work underway. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Joyce.
Thank you, Terry. I am going to, I don't need to see me again. I'm going to use most of Terry's slides because she didn't seem to want me to bring too many of them. As Terry posed the question, how did we make a pedestrian walkable area out of a car-centric intersection? And we started this by the vision. She mentioned the strategic investment plan, and that was really a community vision. We had hundreds of residents come between 1998 and 2000 to probably 10 or 12 events, and everyone helped us figure out what we should do. And the premise was we should bring the residential character of Shaker to the commercial districts. Shaker was built in the early 1900s based on the Garden City movement. Our commercial areas, though, were not developed until the 40s and 50s and largely didn't look like Shaker Heights, didn't have the same quality as Shaker Heights. And so that's what we aim to do. The strategic investment plan was a very valuable plan. We've been using it for 20 years as our guidebook. And that plan was kind of a master plan on steroids. It included a market study, a financing study, a traffic study, an urban design plan. And all these together set us on the course of what we should do next. As Terry mentioned, so from 2000 to 2008, we largely worked at the Shakertown Center area. In 2008, we did another plan for the district called the Transit-Oriented Development Plan, because that is what we wanted. We wanted walkable, transit-oriented development. And that was the specific plan that set us on the course for this catalytic project that is now being built. The next thing we had to do after we had the plan and the vision is to figure out how can we make this reality. This intersection had 65,000 cars a day. It was very confusing, congested, unsafe. You could see it was 6 ways coming in. You waited at the light for 3 minutes. We used to call it the 2 latte intersection because we did have a Starbucks. You could run in, get your lattes, come back out. And you couldn't turn left anywhere, so you had to go around the block. So first we thought we should fix the roads. Well, that's very difficult to do, and we didn't do it alone. We had lots of partners. The Cuyahoga County Engineer's Office was our primary partner. NOACA, ODOT, there were 7 sources of funding in order to raise $19 million for this road reconfiguration. And it was important to get a 4-way intersection for many reasons. The primary is to cross the road. The way it was, you couldn't ever make it across on a red cycle. So we decided that we had to relocate Northfield Road to the south in order to make this a 4-way intersection and to close Van Aken at Farnsley. And so that's what we have now done, and if you go through, the road work is now complete. Our other way to make this reality was to find a developer, and we had one developer come, and we selected them as a master developer, and as soon as they realized how difficult the project was, they exited the scene. So we needed to find a developer. We did lots of research into developments and developers, and what we found is in inner ring suburbs, the developer was almost always local and had a stake and really had an emotional tie to the area. And we were very fortunate that one of the shopping centers that's being redeveloped, the one that you see on the left-hand side of the slide, was owned by RMS, which is the holding company of the Ratner family, who owns Forest City. And they do a lot of mixed-use developments as Forest City, but this would be a private development. And they became our partner in many ways, not just for the development, but for all the other planning that we did in the area, and we still do. We do this together. If it's private, if it's public, we all do it together. The other major partner we had is RTA, and we still have. As part of the road work, we built a busway for them that is parallel to the rapid tracks. Prior to this, riders had to sometimes cross 5 and 6 lanes of traffic in order to make their connections. And now their connections are adjacent, which is safer for everyone. And we continue to work with RTA because in order to make this happen, they need to build a new substation and a new bathroom house. And so there's an ongoing talk about that. So this is the RMS development from a top view. If you wanted to see more, thevanAkendistrict.com has our full deck of images and is being updated all the time. As Terry mentioned, you can see the construction out of the ground now. The parking garage, 350 spaces, is being built, as is the apartment building, which is 100 apartments. It will also have 60,000 square feet of office and 80,000 square feet of restaurant and retail. What was very important with this site plan was to make sure that the streets felt like Shaker Heights. The streets connect to our grid of streets into the neighborhoods is an extension of our streets. And it took us probably a year with RMS to figure out the site plan, to make sure we were doing it right. The buildings are right on the street. There is a park in the middle, which we call the living room, because this really should be the gathering place for Shaker Heights, which we've never had. We never had a downtown. And it's very walkable. It's very interesting. The office space is almost completely leased at this point. It's about 80% full. We have ABA Insurance Company and also a law firm called McGlinchey Stafford. They cited reasons that they wanted to be here is that it was walkable, that the employees really desired a more urban area than where their other offices were located. As Terry mentioned, we have a bunch of interesting retailers, and we heard about Goldhorn Brewery, which we're very happy is coming. We have Rising Star Coffee, Shinola, Detroit, which is a watch and bicycle manufacturer. We have Mitchell's Ice Cream, which you can see here in a very exciting building. Harry's Pizzeria from Miami. Jonathan Sawyer will be having a fine dining restaurant. restored cold-pressed juices, urban orchard, and more, and there's more being announced. And we never stop planning. In our 5th plan, oh, I think I'm missing a picture. There it is. In our 5th plan, we just finished our connections plan. And the connections plan is a plan for bicycle and pedestrian connections from the residential district and the commercial areas into this area. I feel silly saying this, but there are some people who are worried about safety and about walking to the district at night or even during the day. And we want to make everyone feel very welcome and secure. And so we figure a wider sidewalk with nice landscaping and lighting will help with the connections into the district. And this is a view, this is actually Indianapolis, but our goal is a 10-foot wide multi-purpose path. We now have secured 2 grants, one for the Farnsley piece of $1 million from NOACA that will be constructed in 2018. And in 2019, we are waiting for confirmation from NOACA at their board meeting in June of a $1.5 million grant for the Warrensville piece, which would be the main piece going all the way down Warrensville. And then I'd lastly want to talk a little bit about housing. We do a lot of housing work in Shaker. The Moreland neighborhood is one of those red-lined areas, lots of foreclosures, lots of disinvestment. We had the Moreland housing competition earlier this year, and it was the goal was to find innovative infill housing for the district. We have Avalon Station Phase 2, 66-unit townhouse that is being proposed on a piece of land that has no incentives available. And that is being built by Knez Developers, who is also working in Ohio City and Lakewood. So some west side type of development coming to the east side. And then finally, the townhomes of Van Aken, which is the largest picture here on the left. This is also in the Moreland neighborhood. This is 33 units of townhomes. It does have 100% tax abatement, and this is being built by Vintage Developers, who also have built Battery Park in Detroit Shoreway. So we are starting to see, I think, some development and developers from the west side coming east. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. I foolishly thought that you all might not have questions, so I created a bunch of questions of my own related to infrastructure investments on the east side to give the panel something to talk about. I think we will defer on that. Maybe we'll have an infrastructure conversation on another evening so that we can get to your questions, of which I have a lot of them. I've been sorting them. Let's start with a couple for Mansfield, because I know he'll need to be leaving shortly. The first one, Mr. Frazier, how can I get in touch with you? I think it's from Oprah. I make jokes about Oprah, but it's actually true. Mansfield was featured in Oprah's magazine under the headline, "We Love This Guy." Isn't that right, Mansfield?
The only problem was, after that, it was like one of those like pages. They liked me. And I told her, Oprah, I like you too, but I'm a married man. But she kept calling me, you know. Wow.
All right, so that was an easy one. This is a little harder, Mansfield.
My email address is mansfieldf@gmail. Easiest way to get in touch with me.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you another question, though, that's a little bit more complicated. For Mansfield, what can stop the exodus of families from East Side neighborhoods?
What can stop the
exodus, people from leaving?
Building more quality homes. That's a no-brainer. But you have to determine where to do that, which neighborhoods can sustain that, and we have to come to the realization that 30 years ago, planners, people that Steve Litt knows, deep thinkers, they said if you allow the core of cities to die, the suburbs are going to die soon after, like an apple rotting from the inside. And that's starting to happen. Some cities, particularly Detroit is the poster boy, they're past the tipping point in some neighborhoods. I submit that certain Cleveland neighborhoods are past the tipping point. You're not going to build homes there. No one wants them. General Motors is not going to helicopter in and open you an auto plant. Not going to happen. If they build an auto plant, it's going to be below the cotton curtain, meaning down south. You have to be judicious in determining where to build the homes so that people will have value after they're built. The others you have to abandon. That's why I did urban farming. I submit that some plots of land on the east side of Cleveland, particularly those close to the lake, can only survive by farming them. And if somebody else has a better idea, I wish they'd share it with me. They're just those lots are going to sit there vacant for the next 50 years unless we farm them, but I say farm them with high value crops. Then you can cluster homes around that. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's jump to a different topic. Here's one. Actually, let's ask this one because whoever asked this question has the best handwriting in the room. The question is, why do philanthropic organizations not provide support to inner ring suburbs? There's a complementary question that asks about how can development get jump-started in the inner ring, particularly on the east side, since funding from most large foundations doesn't occur outside of the city proper. Joyce, I don't know if you want to weigh in on how we can get development jump-started in the east side suburbs?
Well, it's a hard question. We've dealt with it also that foundations do not invest in the inner ring suburbs, so you have to find different ways. And that's what's really hard. And in Shaker, we go for a lot of grants and try to use that as a way to jumpstart what we're doing, do infrastructure improvements first, and then try to get a developer in once you've fixed whatever or improved your street and your infrastructure. But it is hard. Philanthropic organizations have missions. And some will start working in the inner ring. And I think it's just having conversations with all those organizations and seeing who's ready for a little bit of a mission change to an adjacent area.
Thanks, Joyce.
I get in trouble for saying this, but philanthropic organizations, not only in Cleveland but around the country, really need to rethink their missions. They haven't rethought their missions in 50 years. They don't, and they avoid rethinking their missions, and they need to. So there goes that grant I was looking at from from one foundation.
That was the woman who said woohoo.
Here's a question for Rick, and maybe Wayne, you might also want to weigh in on this. The question is, how specifically does bringing people to an area to eat and drink and spend money build community? How do we help residents of the community, in other ways? There's a parallel question here that asks makes the same point, but also asks about how we can energize the east side through more employment. Do you have any insights into that?
Actually, it's an interesting conversation. As I mentioned before in my shorter conversation, when I bought Sterling's in 2012 after owning a construction company, and I never wanted to own a restaurant or a bar in my life, by the way, but I realized it was an institution, and what I realized was it was an institution built in 1954, and in 2012, a majority of the people that used to frequent that institution left, and what I've realized is mass builds mass. And so people will come to Sterling's. Everyone probably has been to Sterling's. They love Sterling's, but they come there once a year. They come there twice a year. But Sterling's itself couldn't survive unless there was something else around it. And one of the great things about the city of Cleveland is that we're very grassroots. We're very Rust Belt. We're very support our own. And I realized that if you put other things around things that people like, you will start to create that mass. On the east side, unfortunately, until we've started to do things like this, and Joyce has started just, and the Ratners have done it in Shaker Heights, and Mansfield has done it in Hough. We haven't had that opportunity on the east side, and we're now starting to show people that you can do that. Again, I sit in Sterling's, I sit in Cafe 55, I sit in Goldhorn Brewery, and I see people that have never been in that neighborhood before. And it's really interesting now that we've announced that we're going to be in Shaker Heights. There are a lot of people from Shaker Heights coming to Goldhorn saying, well, we know you're going to be there in a year, so we wanted to come to see what you're all about. And so, like it or not like it, in the city of Cleveland, if you serve people food and beer, they're going to show up, which is perfectly fine by me because I serve people food and beer. And so it's a really interesting correlation in a place like Cleveland that has got some great things going for it. University Circle is known for its institutions and its hospitals and everything else. And we're in this great spot in between downtown and University Circle. And what we realize is that you need to give people an excuse to come to a neighborhood they've never wanted to come to before. Or they said, my grandparents used to be there, but I haven't wanted to be there because of, and let's be honest, there's been issues on the east side and the west side. And so what we're doing with food and beer in the city of Cleveland is bringing people to neighborhoods that they might not want to be at before. And all I've ever said for the last couple of years is, I'll get you to my neighborhood, and you're gonna want to come back.
Only in Cleveland do you have beer scouts, by the way. I think that's really important. I think what Rick and what Mansfield are doing, they're basically ambassadors for these neighborhoods. They don't get the diplomatic immunity or the traveling privileges of most ambassadors, but they're bringing strangers to these neighborhoods and increasing the affinity and the connection to neighborhoods that people have long forgotten. So I think they play a very important role. I'm going to take a little bit of exception with what Mansfield said earlier, because all our organization did for about 20 years was build quality housing. 4 years ago, we changed course and added those other two portfolios because we realized that housing was critical, but if you didn't have a good school, you weren't going to keep any families or recruit any families. And if you don't have the social services or at least somebody thinking through how people are getting to work from those houses and how people are getting to school and to recreation from those houses, none of that matters. But I think what's really critical in what Rick and what others in this arena are doing is that there's an increasing percentage of the population, mostly young people without children and old people without children, but the middle is shrinking ever more and more, that want to live in places with restaurants, with bars, with grocery stores. My wife and I live and a soon-to-be child, so we're shrinking that lower section there. We live 3 houses south of Nighttown, and in addition to being close to one of the best music venues in the country, we get to walk to Dave's. We get to walk to 4 or 5 great restaurants, 3 different bars, a park, an elementary school. That is what we define as a great lifestyle, is being able to do all of that without getting the car out of the garage, which we also have, which is still necessary in Cleveland. But the work of building comprehensive communities has never been more important, but it takes all of those things. And you eliminate one of those things, and you start to decrease the amount of people that are interested in living there.
Just, I apologize for not to interrupt, but as Wayne said, as we've talked about before, you have to start somewhere. And I believe in a place like St. Clair, where there used to be 50,000 people who lived there and worked there and was the highest Eastern European population outside of Slovenia, that worked at the Richmond Brothers building, that if you looked at a skyscape of Richmond Brothers, the parking lot's smaller than the one here at the library, but they used to have all these people. You have to start somewhere. And so what I've decided to do is start in the bones of the neighborhood, which is the culture, the Eastern European style. I'd be remiss to let everyone know that we haven't talked about the fact that Richard Clark and the St. Martin de Porres family are building a $24 million high school around the corner from Hub 55. It's the biggest, largest educational investment in the city of Cleveland outside the Cleveland Public School District in 100 years. They're building something that neighborhoods desperately need. And so to Wayne's point, you need entertainment, you need education, and you need housing. You can't do it all at once. And I think that what we're showing on the east side is that we're deliberately doing it one step at a time. And if you look at a place like St. Clair Superior with what I'm doing, which in my opinion is a small step compared to someone who's building a $25 million high school that employs children and teachers and is got a huge, great track record. The other pieces come, but you have to start somewhere. So in a way, if you want to say that guy's the one starting with beer, I'll take it. So.
Jerry, one other thing, you mentioned jobs. Most people think that I built a vineyard and we're building a winery because I wanted to entertain my hobby. No, it creates jobs. We're halfway through building our winery. Once the winery is completed, we need 25 to 30 more acres. That's a lot of land to build more vineyards right in the east side of Cleveland. That will create hundreds of new jobs. And we use these jobs as transitional jobs. We're not expecting our young people to become permanent farmers, but we want to stabilize their lives when they're young, to give them a job, to get them into school, to get them more training, and it's worked. We hire young people in high school. We start them at $9.50 an hour, and they stay. And I gotta go.
Thanks, Mansfield.
All right.
I think building on the conversation that kind of is already underway, here's a question for really all of you. And Mansfield, I know you're going to be sad not to be able to help tackle this one, is how can individuals and organizations support economic and community development without gentrification?
Well,
I think Mansfield just redlined us, by the way. It's a really critical question, but the map that I showed at the beginning of my presentation shows you that we have unlimited amounts of space to do both. The policy solutions that we need to come up with are how can we keep property taxes reasonable for existing residents despite their neighborhoods being vastly improved around them. That's really the only issue we have in Cleveland. Displacement is not a problem in terms of space or in terms of home cost. It's really only about property tax. And if we come up with a solution to that, which we have the wherewithal and the commitment to doing, gentrification should not be a word that we hear for another 30 or 40 years in Cleveland's continued revitalization.
Yeah, I always think gentrification is kind of a funny word because it makes people think that somebody who's got a lot of money is going to move into a neighborhood and kick somebody out who doesn't. And I will tell you that in the St. Clair neighborhood, while we don't have the residential piece yet, since we've built Cafe 55, Goldhorn Brewery, and then rehabbed Sturley's, 75% of the people that work for me live and walk to work. Which to me is about as anti-gentrification as you can be. So, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the housing neighborhood, but the way we should look at gentrification is that if I can support those people in the neighborhood, they're going to want to stay there. People that have worked for me are now deciding to rent houses or buy houses in the neighborhood, and that to me is more important than what's going to happen in the residential community if somebody who wants to get a cheap house is going to move in. The way we look at it is if I can support the community from an economic standpoint and a job standpoint, they're the people that are going to want to stay. Are other people going to come in? Sure. But if I can make sure that the people that are there right now and that work for me and I can support them stay there, then that's even more important.
So I want to answer this a little bit different way. In Shaker, gentrification has not been an issue, but individuals can participate in the reinvestment. We have a Shaker Heights Development Corporation, and there are opportunities for commercial investment in buildings, especially along Lee Road, that has not seen investment in many decades. And our development corporation are getting consortiums of residents and other investors together to buy buildings and rehab buildings and put them back into productive use.
Okay.
Well, here's a big question for anyone. Won't it take a significant increase in population in Cleveland and the region to see economic development take off?
Not really, no. We've seen our population decline slow and plateau. And now the resettlement trends that we're seeing, Richie Peperanen at Cleveland State has done some of the best demographic work around this topic. Cleveland has the ability to grow again. We're the top 5 cities, aside from the usual suspects of Columbus and Dayton, are all major metropolitan areas where we're getting new residents from. The DC, Alexandria metro area, Atlanta, and Baltimore, as well as Brooklyn, are in the 4 of the top 5 that people are coming to Cleveland to live the lives they want there, but at a cheaper, more affordable rate. And so we're seeing a lot of interesting things there. The other side is that economic development is about priorities. And when people start spending money on things they value, getting out of their cars, not spending $3,000 a year on car insurance, for instance, helps them spend that $3,000 on job creating things in the communities that they live in. So it's really about shifting the spending of existing residents as well as attracting new. Is that fair?
Sort of the flip side of population growth, I suppose, really relates to this question. It's hypothetical. If I'm a residential contractor, why am I not taking advantage of the rehab housing stock if there is demand? Is it a question of capital? And I think that the question of demand is a really important one. I referred to the project that Rick helped us do in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood. We rehabbed that house for as little money as we possibly could using free student labor. And it still cost about $50,000 just to bring the house into code compliance. And this is in a neighborhood where houses sell on average for under $20,000. And so if there's a gap of $30,000 between the cost of rehabbing and what you can actually sell the finished product for, it makes for really difficult math. The other challenge that we faced in St. Clair Superior is that when we tried to get the house appraised, we couldn't get an appraisal. We had appraisers come out, but because there was nothing like the house, admittedly, this was a student design house, so it was a bit of an oddball, but the appraiser couldn't find a comp, and so he couldn't appraise the property. And so when we were finally able to sell the house, we had to sell it for cash because it, to Mansfield's point, it wasn't possible to make a mortgage. This is a problem in some East Side neighborhoods, not all of them, and certainly, hopefully, kind of not a problem, significant problem in the inner ring suburbs, although I think there are some neighborhoods, particularly in Maple, Garfield, East Cleveland, where low housing values really make it difficult to do rehab. I don't know if you all have comments about that.
Well, I just want to say it is a problem in certain neighborhoods, most neighborhoods in Shaker Heights with 2-family homes. Single-family home rehab, I think the numbers can work in an inner-ring suburb because it's a rehabber who wants to rehab the house, have someone buy it and move on. In a 2-family house, it's harder to sell it and move on. Usually those are held by investors. And so we do see a good number of rehabs and singles, but in doubles, it has been an issue.
Yeah, so that's why in my presentation I talked about the appraisal gap and the need for medium scaled rehabbers, because doing 1 or 2 rehabs without comps is really ill-advised for any developer, because as Terry just talked about, you're going to lose your shirt. But if you're doing 8 to 10 rehabs in a concentrated area, then you use your own rehabs as comps, and you start to drive the market a little bit. You're going to take a loss on units 1 and 2, a big one on 1, a little one on 2, hopefully. But then by the 3rd and 4th one, you're getting out of it what you put in. And by 6 through 10 is where you make the money, where you make your money back. So just economically, it's a model that we need to utilize. And it's why you're seeing projects like Zaremba has done around the city, particularly in Slavic Village at a project called Mill Creek. They started taking a loss of about $20,000 to $30,000 on the units they were developing Fleming by selling those first units at 119. But by the time that project was developed, which was 300 units, they sold the last unit for north of $300,000. And so they were able to develop at scale. We don't expect there to be mill creeks all over the place, nor do we want those kinds of large-scale developments all over, but that's why we need rehabbers that are able to take on some kind of scale. Rick, did you have anything to, as a developer?
You know, it's interesting. In the St. Clair Superior neighborhood, one of the things we talk about is the next step is the residential. And if anybody is familiar with our neighborhood around St. Vitus and St. Martin de Porres, one of the things I always do, and if anybody wants to come by, I'll walk you around. I walk people out of Shirley's Country House, and I walk them down Bonner Avenue where my grandmother lived, and I walk them by St. Vitus, and the first thing that they say is, this is a really great neighborhood. There's some people here that have a lot of pride in their house. There's a lot of still owner-operators that are still there. And to Terry's point, when we did their house with them on 67th Street, the problem is it's all about the perception, which is you can't get a comp there. No one's ever going to spend the money there. And you need to find the right individuals to do houses there. Listen, you can get really inexpensive houses in St. Clair Superior right now, but they're fantastic houses. And what it takes is somebody like a Kent State University and St. Clair Superior and our corporation who took a risk to say, we can build a house that someone's going to spend $70,000 on. And Wayne's point, it's difficult to do that in mass. And what you really need to do is concentrate around areas like Slavic Village, like the areas in Shaker. It's interesting to think about that we're talking about the same thing in Shaker Heights that we're talking about in St. Clair Superior, which is you can't get a mortgage for that. Who would have ever thought about that 30 or 40 years ago? But literally, I could walk you around St. Clair Superior and show you houses that anybody would love to have. The problem is that they all need a little bit of work. And unfortunately, there are organizations that won't lend, even though they make a lot of financial sense because of the perception of it. And so there's places like Neighborhood Progress and the Cleveland Fund. Those are the places that we need to lean on at this point to say, we, just like we're doing at the Hub and they're doing it at St. Martin de Porres, we'll show you that these places make sense. Just take a risk, which, by the way, isn't that big of a risk. You just need to take it.
I think the scale question is a really important one, and I wish Mansfield was still here because he raised this kind of specter of the fact that, the possibility that there may be some neighborhoods that have passed a point of no return, and I hope that that isn't true. But having spent a lot of time in city neighborhoods in particular, when we tackled this one little house on East 67th, it was supposed to be a 6-month project. It actually took a little over 2.5 years. Sorry. Rick stayed with us till the bitter end. But the fact is there are over 8,000 properties on that DNF list in the city of Cleveland that are vacant and abandoned and will most likely be demolished if someone doesn't rehab them. And the fact that it took us 2.5 years to do one house means that Kent State's probably not the answer if you're trying to get to scale. And so when we originally wanted to do the house next door, but it was demolished while we were working on our house. And then we looked at the house across the street, it was also demolished. And they both needed to be demolished. There's no question about it. We couldn't get to them fast enough. So I do think that there's a problem. And the problem is one of capital and one of market demand. I hesitate with this question, but I'm going to raise it anyway because I have a slide for it. Someone asked about the implications of Opportunity Corridor for each of your projects, and I just happen to have one. There are a couple of really big infrastructure investments happening on the east side. Opportunity Corridor is one of them. The others I've just kind of teed up here were the Midway project, which you all may know about. It's a bike infrastructure project. Here in the Heights, we have the luxury of these old streetcar streets like Fairmont and Euclid Heights, and when the streetcars were pulled out, we have these lovely medians. But in a lot of parts of the city, what we have are really wide streets. It's why Clifton Boulevard is so wide. It's why Superior is so wide. And so the Midway project is a bike, sort of a protected bike lane, and the pilot for the Midway is planned to run along Superior from Public Square east, pretty much to the Gold Horde Brewery. And the city is committed to doing the pilot. There's no funding for it as yet, but projects, one way or the other, big infrastructure investments do tend to have an impact on development. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to comment either on Opportunity Corridor or the Midway, or, kind of while we're at it, we can talk about the Healthline corridor and the other East Side investments that may come about as a result of these infrastructure projects. Joyce, I know your projects really are driven by, kind of transit-oriented development as well. So do you guys have thoughts about the relationship of infrastructure to investment?
Well, I can talk a little bit about transit because Shaker Heights has 2 transit lines going through, and it's very important to our Van Aken district is to have that development. And we have looked at the Health Line and the amount of development that has occurred along the Health Line, which is amazing. And we point that out to investors and to developers that we can have the same kind of impact from that transportation. But that is, bus and rail. I am not convinced about Opportunity Corridor and how much development, because it is such a vast area.
So I'll start with Opportunity Corridor. I've been in lots of meetings about Opportunity Corridor. I think it's going to be a great opportunity for the city. I can tell you that because we're way up there and Opportunity Corridor is dead way down here, that I'm sure it's going to be great. I can tell you from an infrastructure standpoint, I think that the role of the city and any other government that can do infrastructure, they don't realize the giant pluses it has to the city. That Midway photo was actually St. Clair. If you take a street like St. Clair from 72nd Street to downtown, they used to have streetcars running down it, and you put dedicated bike lanes in it, the impact it would have in neighborhoods would be phenomenal. Not only from people that want to live there, but want to start businesses there. And so infrastructure to me is where the cities, for me, the city of Cleveland, for the city of Shaker Heights, for here, the city of Cleveland Heights, infrastructure is the best thing that cities can do to help developers. Do really great infrastructure and then get out of our way. And then we'll figure out the rest. If you look at something simple, and I don't want to compare it west side to east side, and this is the last time and the only time I'm going to do this tonight. I'm a block away from the lake at Goldhorn and Sterling's Country House and our construction company and some of the residential stuff we're doing. If you look at what we're spending on Route 2 between downtown and Lakewood and the cross-throughs and the boulevards and everything else, if you did stuff like that on the east side, the amount of impact that would have on development would be outrageous. If anybody here thinks that people would be living in Battery Park and building Battery Park if it wasn't for the infrastructure improvements that the city of Cleveland and the state are doing, you're crazy. Because they didn't live there before. They're living there now because I can now bike to the lake. I can now walk across the street to the lake. I don't have to cross a freeway to the lake. So do infrastructure improvements all across the city, and you can see the benefit that it's doing. I don't have the numbers, but there are hundreds and hundreds of apartments and living residences and people going into Battery Park and everywhere else on the west side because of the fact that we're now doing infrastructure improvements that improve the lifestyle of the people that are going to live there. We just ripped down the first energy plant a block away from my brewery. It used to be the largest power plant in the world. If you turn that into a green space and you connect it to the lake and you do the same things that they're doing from downtown to Lakewood, you can't tell me that that's not going to have the same huge positive improvements. So infrastructure to me is the place that the state and the city and the county can benefit us the most. And the rest of it, again, get out of our way and we'll figure it out.
The only thing I would add to that is that if public funds are going to be used, we as taxpayers and residents need to demand that the infrastructure be equitable infrastructure. The jury, I think, is still out in many respects. Neighborhood Progress is supportive. We're doing everything we can to make Opportunity Corridor a good project. But it is also fair to say that it's indeterminate how that's going to improve those neighborhoods at this point. It could be one of the best things to happen. It could be another version of kind of an urban renewal project, in that the light manufacturer that's slated to fill the corridor is one of the lowest jobs to square foot ratios in economic development, right? Logistics doesn't actually employ that many people. But when you look at the Healthline corridor, they've gotten a return on their investment of $12 for every $1 of public money spent. Midway could be in the same ballpark because people want to be places where they feel comfortable and engaged. And so I would just really encourage us not to pass judgment on any of those three projects, but realize that when our public money gets put into projects, it should benefit the least among us first, and those of us that can afford to get wherever we want to get, however we want to get there, probably farther down the road. Those projects work in that order because of that equitable aspect in many ways.
Well, it's 8:30, so unfortunately we need to wind down. I apologize to all of you whose questions I didn't get to, but perhaps our speakers may be willing to stick around for a few minutes if you wanted to talk with them directly. Thank you so much for coming tonight and being such an engaged audience. I really enjoyed reading your questions, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.